Okay, today we are going to do Africa. Say hello, class.
Hello, loser.
Gordon is rude. That was Gordon. Okay. Anyway, today we're going to study Africa from Units 1 to Unit 6. So, class, tell me, what's doing in Africa in Unit 1? River Valley Civilizations?
Oh, Nile River.
That's not a civ, but yes, the Nile River exists. It begins somewhere in here-ish, at Lake Victoria, and it kind of winds its way down and ends up in the Mediterranean. But who are some of the civilizations that exist here? All right, good. One of them is Egypt, which actually just starts to form around here. It is the Kush, yeah. So we have the civilization of Egypt, but also people are mentioning that we have Kush, which is further down here in Sudan. Why are the Kush notable? What do they do?
Take over Egypt.
Good. In around 1000, they take over Egypt. But let's focus more on the Egyptians. What is going on with the Egyptians? Tell me about them. I spelled Egypt wrong. All right, Egypt. What are some Egyptian things? All right, so some of their cultural advancements. They have pyramids. What are the pyramids used for? They're basically giant graves for pharaohs. Good. What else do they represent? In fact, what do the pharaohs represent? Who are the pharaohs? They are, right, not only are they the leaders, and it's a strong, centralized government, but they are supposed to be gods themselves, right? They're connected to the gods. So the pyramids also stood as a monument to the gods. What type of religion do they have? Good. Polytheistic, a belief in multiple gods, like Ra, the sun god, or Horus, who was the one with the... No, Anubis was the one with the dog's head. Horus is one. Ra is a bunch. I can't remember any of the other ones. Osiris, yes, who was a female goddess. Yes. So Egypt's... What we start to see with Unit 1, and this is of all the River Valley civilizations, are the beginning of cultural trends, which are going to continue and grow and expand throughout Unit 2. We don't really see the rise and spread of monotheistic religions on any great note until the latter part of the Roman Empire, but realistically Unit 3, with the rise and spread of Buddhism and Islam and all of those things. But we do start to see in Unit 1 the growth of cultures, which are going to persist and grow over time. So tell me about political Egypt. What's going on politically? You've already mentioned one. Who's in control? Good. So the pharaoh is in control, and like we mentioned, they are godlike, right? But what's more important about the pharaoh, and I've already mentioned this, is that they were in control of a centralized kingdom. Unlike with Mesopotamia, they are not individual city-states aligned. They are one solid, centralized unit. And the pharaoh makes all the decisions for the entire unit. So how can we also class the economy then? No, a caste system would be social, but tell me about the economy. Who controls it? Good. To be vague about it, it's controlled by the state. Right, so we have a state-directed, a state-run economy. We see the same things with Chinese dynasties. We do not, however, see this with other groups like the Indus or the Mesopotamians who have a merchant class. But with Egypt, the Egyptian state controls the economy also. So this is also going to give rise to the beginning of centralized states. So in Units 2, 3, and 4, when we start to see other governance come about, one of the earliest examples of governance is a centralized state, which might help explain why that transitions into empire first, and not like a more democratically elected city-state. What else is going on in this period of time? Who else exists, particularly around here, who are going to migrate down there? Does anybody remember? The Bantu. Good. The Bantu people, who migrate down south mostly for agricultural reasons. They find the lands are actually richer and more fertile down here, which is true. There are some really fertile lands down here. And they move there. This is why we also see the rise of Bantu root languages. Bantu is a language root. For example, Swahili, commonly spoke on the East Coast, particularly during Unit 3 when we see Muslim merchants trading on the east coast of Africa. It is a combination of both Arabic and Bantu, which is kind of neat. So Bantu, not only are they as stateless peoples who migrate down south, pretty much throughout all of Unit 1, 2, and parts of 3, but they're also creating a common cultural heritage, which we still see in Africa today. All right, so what's going on in Unit 2 in Africa then? From 600 BCE to 600 CE. And my mind is initially, even though I cut a piece of Africa off, my mind is initially going here. Who's an empire that exists right there on the tip of northern Africa? Carthage. Excellent. What can you guys tell me about Carthage? Who were their enemies? Rome. Good. They fought the Roman Republic. This is way back in the 260s to 160s BCE. Good. This is where we see Hannibal, not Lecter the Cannibal, but Hannibal of Carthage, who was a Spanish general. The Carthaginian Empire encompassed basically all of this. It's what's later going to become part of the Roman Empire. This was all Carthage. And also into Spain, which is not on this map. Hannibal was a Spanish general. He would use what particular beast, which I love? Elephants, right? He used war elephants to go to battle. Unfortunately, I remember the story, he chose to march them over the Alps, a mountain range throughout Italy, and a lot of them died. Poor choice, you don't put elephants on a mountain. But this all stands for this larger conflict between Rome and Carthage. And what's the bigger lesson here? What are they fighting over and why? They're fighting over land. Why? What are one of the really big trends that happens throughout mostly Units 2 and 3? Territorial expansion. Now, I would say the earlier units, the main themes, like you can't get this wrong if you make this your answer, is either trade or territorial expansion. All empires are looking to trade to be prosperous and to grow their land and grow their territory. So we see a lot of trade and a lot of territorial expansion early on. In later units, everything is kind of guided by either industrialization, westernization, or imperialism. Right? So things change. But initially, it's all about land and it's all about territorial expansion. Carthage wants to expand its lands, Rome wants to expand its land, and when they start to expand into the same territory, they fight each other, and the Romans win because of a few military victories and Carthaginian failures. But what ends up happening is Carthage falls. Yep, no longer here, and all of this land instead becomes Roman. Good. The Bantu are still on their migratory path south. And what we are going to see soon, or we are going to start to see the rise of some kingdoms over here. We call this region the Sahel. We call them the Sahelian kingdoms. We are going to start to see some kingdoms rise, particularly well after Rome falls, and there is no longer that empirical presence in North Africa. So let's do that now. There were, in Unit 3 in particular, there were three main empires that we talked about that formed here. What are they in order? Excellent. We have Ghana, we have Mali, and we have Songhai. Let's focus in on Mali, though. Who was the most famous king of Mali? Yes, we have Mansa Musa. Tell me about him. He was rich, but Selma, why was he rich? How did he make his money?
Because his empire was sitting on a gold mine.
Yeah, quite literally sitting on a gold mine. But what else was he selling? Salt. Gold mines and salt. And on what trade network was he selling his gold and salt? The Trans-Sahara. And what did the Trans-Sahara connect them to? Yeah, to the Middle East, particularly Mecca. Yeah, he went on the thing. What do we call it? The Hajj. He went on his pilgrimage to Mecca. There are a lot of different empires and groups and stuff all connecting, but this is the Trans-Saharan Trade Network, which connected Western African kingdoms to the Islamic world. So then, tell me more about Mansa Musa. What religion did he practice? Good. He was a Muslim. He practiced Islam. He converted why? Good. It was primarily economic reasons. Well, no, for religious reasons also. But there was also an economic component there. He converted to Islam because it gave him a better trading and political relationship with the Middle East, which helped him become really popular. It helped solidify and legitimize his power over his people, that he was able to bring in this wealth and command armies and make trades with another powerful group. And, of course, become really wealthy. And on his journeys, they say that he brought so much gold with him that he actually caused inflation and a lot of economic problems along the way, because he would quite literally give gold out to people, which floods the market and inflates it. But the man was probably, they always say this, probably the richest man that's ever lived. if you take into account the amount of money, which is awesome. So in that region, we have a lot of gold mines. Gold mines, by the way, are down here in the foresty areas, and salt is up here in the more deserty regions. They're doing really well. Songhai, you're also going to see Islam. But ultimately, what happens? It's not that they fought. I mean, there's always going to be empires fighting to take over one another. For example, Songhai fights Mali and takes over and becomes the Dona Empire. That always kind of happens. But ultimately, how do things change for Africa? The Bantu, by the way, are over here now. Right, Europe starts to get involved. And this is problematic. I mean, we just grazed over a whole lot from 600 to 1450. But after 1450, particularly in 1453, what city falls? Constantinople falls, which was a Christian trading city on the edge of the Islamic Empire. And when it becomes an Islamic city, the Christians decide they want to start trading elsewhere. And that's when the Christians, in greater number, start to travel down the coast of Africa. So what we start to notice instead is instead of land-based travel, connecting Africans to the Middle East, instead, sea-based travel. And you've got Europeans, come on, you've got Europeans making headway and trading with all of these regions down here. Some of them are also going to come this way and go through Africa this way. And we start to see, instead of landlocked, meaning not by water, land-based kingdoms in West Africa, we start to see coastal kingdoms. Can you guys give me a few examples of some coastal kingdoms? Good. So here we've got the Ashanti. We've got Dahomey. What else? Yeah, we've got Congo with a K. Sorry, they're a little higher. Yeah, so Congo with a K was the kingdom on the... Oh, that's a lot of Ks. Was the kingdom on the coast. Congo with a K was the kingdom on the coast. Say that fast. And then instead, here, later on, we get the Congo, which, by the way, until the 1970s was called Zaire. Have you ever seen or heard the word Zaire? It was called Zaire until the 70s when they changed their name. That was an independence decolonization thing. They went from being Zaire in the 70s to Congo. Named, both of these, by the way, named after the Congo River, which happens to flow like here-ish. Yes, it's called the Congo River Basin. That's the only place in the world where you can find pygmy elephants. And also the gorillas, one of the great apes that we always associate, right? Gorillas that's basically the only region you can find them. For those of you interested, you can find them like here, including some parts of Uganda and Rwanda. But the western lowland gorilla, like the typical gorilla we always think about, that's where they come from. So Tarzan. Anyway, so we've got the Congo down there, the Ashanti, and the Dahomey. You've also got Oyo here. They're going to become... Nigeria, stuff like that. So we've got a bunch of coastal kingdoms instead of inland kingdoms. And who are they trading with? So coastal kingdoms trade with Europeans. Hi. Back to business. So we've got the Ashanti, Dahomey, and Oyo, and we see coastal kingdoms trading with Europeans. But particularly, which Europeans do we see a lot of trading here? Think about what we covered with Latin America at someday. The Portuguese, right. Most of them are going to be Portuguese. And fast forwarding a little bit to colonization of Africa and the Berlin Conference, Portuguese territory ends up becoming Mozambique, Madagascar, and Angola, to name a few. There's a few more. But as we can see, that follows with the idea that the Portuguese were trading on communities. The Portuguese were also the first ones to sail around the Cape of Good Hope. And they did a lot of trading here with their... and then that way. Yes, it was Vasco da Gama. Excellent. You got this. So proud of yourself. So yeah, Vasco da Gama was the first one to round the Cape of Good Hope, which is the southern point in South Africa, and he trades with, and they trade with those countries, which helps explain why they become Portuguese colonies a little bit later on. Anyway, so they're trading with coastal kingdoms. Mostly Portuguese, but a little bit later on we're also going to see a lot of British trade, especially once the British realize that trading is profitable, right? Because initially it's all Spanish and Portuguese, but then the Brits, the Dutch, and the French pick up a little bit later on. So inevitably we are going to see the British too, although the British stayed mostly to West Africa, and the Portuguese kept mostly to Central Africa. This helps explain why we see so many African slaves going to the giant Portuguese colony of Brazil. If you've ever wondered, Brazil got the lion's share, 50%, see pun, got 50% of most of the slaves coming from Africa. Oh, that makes sense. 50% of the slaves coming from Africa went to Brazil. 40% went to the Caribbean, 10% the United States. So it makes sense that if the Portuguese are dominating coastal trade, that the Portuguese are the ones engaging in slave trade, that the Portuguese colony of Brazil is going to get the most slaves. Right? Now, these coastal kingdoms, let's focus in on the Congo. Who was one of the leaders of the Kingdom of Congo?
He had a vote. Yeah. Say it.
What was his name? No, you're fast forwarding a bit to the Belgian Congo. I want the name of the African ruler who ruled in Congo.
He had a European name, didn't he?
No. His African name first was Nzinga Mvemba.
Oh my god, second. That's great.
But you guys are right. He does take a Christian name, right? What does he turn into? Not Pablo. No. Yes, it is Afonso. King Afonso. Generic Spanish name. He becomes King Afonso the First. Why does he change his name to a Christian name? What's the point?
The same thing because of trading.
Yes, you guys are right. The same reason that Mansa Musa did it too, to have a better trading relationship. Because if you've got the Portuguese, my boat's so wonderful. Look at that caravel; it's amazing. The ship that they would have used at the time, by the way, was a caravel, not the ice cream brand Carvel, but caravel. So if you've got the Portuguese trading over here, and the Portuguese are known for buying and sometimes taking slaves, you want to be on their good side. You want to make sure that you are a slave provider, meaning that you are hunting down people and selling them into the slave trade, not losing your own people. Like if these are the flower wars, you want to be the Aztecs, not the victims. You know what I'm saying? So they're going to do what they have to do to maintain a positive relationship. And if that means accepting, because remember the Portuguese and Spanish are really heavy into that religious conversion thing. If that means accepting a new religion to have a better working relationship with them, they're going to do it. Mansa Musa does it, and King Afonso I, or Nzinga Mvemba, does it for the Kingdom of Congo. All right, so we see similar patterns happening here. As a result of all of this, we see slavery intensifying. Why is slavery becoming more intensified?
Because for raw materials, maybe Latin America.
What in Latin America?
Sugar.
Yes, sugar, right? Sugar is becoming a really important commodity, and sugar plantations require a lot of labor. Sugar plantations in Brazil and Colombia are also, like Gordon told us yesterday, very, very violent, and you're likely to die in them. So we need to replace that labor consistently, which explains why we see so many slaves being bought and sold and brought to the New World. We see the intensification of slavery. And out of all of this, in combination with the Enlightenment, which we'll talk about when we do Europe tomorrow, brings out racism. This is not initially a racist transaction, it's an economical one. However, when the West goes through their period of enlightenment, and they're like, all men are equal, they have to reckon with the fact that they are buying and selling humans. And in order to try to make sense of what they're doing, that's when we start to get things like miscegenation, that like crossbreed marriages and stuff like that produces poor children. Or the idea of eugenics, that there are some races that are better than others, which is absolute garbage, right? But there needed to be some sort of justification for why an enlightened Europe still engages in the slave trade. Slavery is abolished, even though it still kind of happens. You're not allowed to buy slaves by like the mid-1800s, but slaves that you still have, you're allowed to keep. So once again, with the Enlightenment in combination with slavery, that's where racism is born. All right. So the Europeans are clearly making waves in Africa. What's going on in Unit 5? 1750 to 1900, what is the defining moment and pattern of interaction for Africa for this period?
Colonization.
Right. I would go further than calling it colonization, though. I would call it imperialism. What's the difference between... That's a great point, though. What's the difference between colonization and imperialism? Because there is a difference. Pratik just punched the desk. I want everybody to know that.
You like kind of force people there, and colonization involved amongst them.
Yes, perfect, Selma. In case you didn't hear that, imperialism is where you go when you take control over the people. Colonization is where you just go to live there. And sometimes you might take control, like when the Spanish moved to the New World, they made a caste system. But ultimately, they were living there. They were marrying, they were breeding, they were trying to create lives. Imperialism, particularly in Africa, they went there and they took over and they exploited. Right? The word I like to use with this is exploit. It's not slavery in the same way we saw it before. It was not an economic transaction, but instead these territories were taken over by Europeans and the people forced to work for them. We would call that exploitation. Right? It's like a New Age slavery. Now, what event is responsible for the imperialism of Africa? The Berlin Conference. Where do you think it was held? You guys are so smart. When was the Berlin Conference? Anybody remember?
1885.
Nice. 84 to 85. And if you can't remember that, it was in the 19th century. It was in the end of the 1800s. If on the exam you put that like in the late 1800s, that's fine too. They're not expecting perfection. So if you put late 1800s, you're good. So the Berlin Conference in the late 1800s saw the partition of Africa. Can you guys give me a couple examples of countries that were colonized and who colonized them? Well, I want to do Africa. So, good. So red is going to be the Belgians. Did they have any other colonies? No, it was literally just that one. We'll get to South Africa in a minute, you're right. Now, what's interesting about Belgium, though, is that wasn't actually controlled by Belgium, the country. It was controlled by one man, King Leopold II, who treated it as like his private playground. And major atrocities were committed there because there was not any government oversight. Not that that would have prevented violence anyway, but because basically it was his land, and he profited off of it. That's where we see all of those horrible atrocities, like rubber quotas, and if the kids didn't make them, like kids would be slaughtered or hands would be chopped off and stuff like that. So Leopold of Belgium owned that one. Someone mentions South Africa. What European power controlled South Africa? And actually, they controlled all of this.
We kick them out. We kick.
Well, technically Dutch moved there. Who were the Dutch farmers who lived there? The Boers, right? The colony itself was taken over by the British. British had a lot. They had Nigeria also. I think they had Ghana. Hold on, they had a lot. They had Malawi. It's hard to remember all of theirs. Some over here as well. But they had a lot of colonies. You guys are talking about Germany. Germany only had a handful. They had Namibia. By the way, one of the first genocides of the 20th century happened in Namibia against the Herero people. Now, do you guys remember doing the Africa DBQ? One of the sources was from Samuel Maherero of the Herero people. That was actually during the genocidal time. During 1907, there was a genocide. The Germans hunted down and killed the Herero people living within Namibia. And if we understand the rules of genocide, targeting people because of their ethnicity, that would have counted as the first of the 20th century. Shortly after that, we have the Armenian genocide during World War I. So the Germans owned this land. And they also have Tanzania. This is where a lot of the battles in World War I took place between the British and the Germans on that line. What else was German land? They had one more. Does anybody know it?
Germany?
Yeah.
It's actually Cameroon. Yeah, it's fine. And we're not going to do all of them, but we have to talk about the French. What lands did the French... I'm purposefully not using French colors for that. Just to annoy people. All of the rest. Nigeria was British, but French West Africa.
Yeah.
So
I know which one was free. Give was free.
all of this basically was French. And wait, they have another one. Ooh, they got some in here. Just to be down here, just to be a perfectionist, I want to have the Portuguese on here also. The Portuguese, which we labeled on the last map, were these. And a small portion of... They also had Sao Tome and Principe, which is an island here. Like a small portion of this. And then, lastly, they're not the only ones, but they're the last ones I'm going to draw, are the Spanish. The Spanish are still kind of around colonizing, but not much. They have Morocco, They have one of these, and they've got Equatorial Guinea, but that's it. And then the other ones are the Italians, who take over basically Somalia, Eritrea. Eventually, they invade Ethiopia to start World War II. And then the last one. We do get involved in a lot of things. Who am I missing? The Portuguese, the French, the British, the Germans, the Spanish, the Italians,
Where's Ethiopia?
the French. I'm missing one. But anyway. So as we can see, most of Africa was colonized with the exception of Liberia and Ethiopia. Marta.
Spain, did they only take over small parts because they were focused on Latin America?
So, interestingly enough, by the time the Berlin Conference happens, 1884, all of Latin America had been free.
Oh, right.
With the exception of Brazil, because that's a different story. They just kind of transitioned power from one Portuguese dude to another. But if we think about the time period, most Latin American revolutions, despite further revolutions and political instability, most of them occurred between 1810 and 1826, which tells us that Spain had actually lost almost all of her colonies. And they take a few things here. Morocco, because it's basically an extension of Spain. If you think about it, there is quite literally a rock separating Europe from Africa. It's a large one. It's called Gibraltar. There's a British naval base there now. It's big enough for a naval base, but it's essentially a giant rock separating these two continents. And they take a few other territories that they had traded with also. But as we can see here, Spain is no longer a major player in the world. They sit out World War I. They sit out World War II. They do have to suffer through a civil war between those, by the way. Francisco Franco, right, and the fascists. But you notice they do stay out of the world wars. They kind of remove themselves from the spotlight. I would say that Spanish Golden Age would probably be Unit 4 with colonization of Latin America and stuff like that.
Tragedy.
But what we're looking at in Africa is, well, exactly, tragedy. And one of the side effects is that, as Walter Rodney would say, Europe underdeveloped Africa. And during the Berlin Conference, when this entire continent was carved up by Europeans only, it's going to create a lot of problems for when they decolonize in the new one. Before we move on really quickly, because we still have a little bit of time, what are the commodities that the Europeans want so badly from Africa? Not gold as much anymore. They'll still take it, but it's rubber, ivory, which comes mainly from elephants, but also from rhinos. What's the other one? We can get them in Indonesia. Good. Palm oil. We can get it in Indonesia as well. Palm oil. A lot of Nigeria's economy, for example, is still based on palm oil. And then, of course, they have other things. We discovered diamonds in South Africa. We discover in Sierra Leone. We discover more gold, more minerals, a lot of zinc, a lot of tin. So these things also, but primarily rubber and ivory, but honestly mostly rubber. Because what is Europe going through in this period of time that they need rubber for? The Industrial Rev and industrialization. In fact, the reason why they turn to Africa is because Africa is so rich in natural resources that they need for industry. And industry is why they're actually able to get in there anyway, because now they have the weapons and they have the medicines required to overcome diseases like malaria, which is a parasite spread by, it's not a virus or a bacteria. Malaria is a parasite spread by mosquitoes that Europeans have no natural defense against. Well, Africans don't either. It sucks. But they live with it more, and their bodies are a little bit more immune to it. But Europeans die in great numbers when they try to explore Africa. Until industry, until they get medicine, until their weapons become strong enough so that they're no longer engaged in a trading relationship with African kingdoms, but instead an exploiting relationship where they go over and they conquer, and it becomes imperialism, not just trade. Now, this does eventually end. Much of Africa becomes independent by the 1960s. Does anybody remember the first country to gain independence? It was in 1957. It was in West Africa. Ghana. Excellent. In 1957, the first country to become independent is Ghana under the leadership of Kwame Nkrumah.
I was in the butcher Disney.
Kwame, and always pronounce the N, Kwame Nkrumah. It's not silent, we don't skip it. Kwame Nkrumah. And what's interesting about Kwame Nkrumah is although he was an elite, he was a champion of two main beliefs. The first was neo-colonialism. That politically, Africa will no longer be colonized. However, economically speaking, and this is similar to Latin America, economically, who's still controlling them? Generally the West. Europe mostly. Nowadays China. Remember we looked at that. Nowadays China. But generally Europe. And he would argue that because they are economically dependent, they are neocolonial. You can disagree with him. This is what he thought back in 1957. Things have changed since then. All right. The other thing that he believed in, the same thing that Marcus Garvey promoted in the United States, was Pan-Africanism. Right? The idea that all Africans everywhere are the same people and that they should all fight for the betterment of the... Bob Marley, right? They should all fight for the betterment of the people. This is what Eric Killmonger believes in Black Panther, for example. That they should rise up together and should be strong and should unite. Today, it's a little bit... It would not be correct to argue that all Africans are the same. Right? Skin color does not unite ideology. Just because you're all from the same continent does not mean that people in Mali suffer the same things that people in Zimbabwe suffer. Right? Nowadays, it's not correct to assume that all people should have to follow the same ideology. Everywhere is different and everybody is different, right? So Pan-Africanism and Pan-Arabism, which is the same thing for Muslim populations, or Arab populations, I should say, although they were expressly anti-Israel. It wouldn't be correct to say that those ideologies are still very popular today, because you can't make that assumption. It's a dangerous assumption to make, that all people from a continent should follow the same ideology. Right? We certainly know that's not true. It's more complex than that. But what we start to see in this period of time is independence. Now, what are the two different types of colonies? Because there's two different paths to independence. One of them are a tropical dependency. A tropical dependency is what?
You don't really colonize.
Right. It's not really colonized, right? There are a few Europeans ruling over what?
Majority.
Good. Ruling over a majority indigenous population, whoever they may be. North African, Sub-Saharan African, or otherwise. The other version is what? Excellent, Kimura. A settlement colony, which is a colony where you settle.
Wow.
Yeah, give me the smart kid's answer. A settlement colony is a colony with settlement. Yeah, technically. What are examples of a few settlement colonies? Good. One of them is South Africa, where you guys already told me earlier we've got Boers, and we've got the British living here, and they're displacing the African populations, like the Zulu who live there. What else is a settlement colony? Kenya, excellent. This becomes a big British colony. It's British East Africa. It becomes a really big British colony. And so when they have to fight for their independence, they go through the Mau Mau uprising, where they have to fight back against them. Does anybody think of a French one? Relatively close to Europe? Yes, I think that was Marta. Algeria, which also goes through a war from... 56 to 62. They also go through 54 to 62. So they go through an 8-year war also. And these are just 3 examples of settlement colonies that have to fight for their freedom. And unfortunately, they have to do so through violence. However, we did discuss a majority of the continent is able to do it through peaceful means. Either a peaceful devolution of power from the Europeans to the Africans because they no longer want to colonize. It's the 20th century. That's kind of out of fashion. We get rid of empires around the world. We still also can't have an empire. Or through leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, who do the bargaining for them. But unfortunately, because of political instability and economic dependency, like what we saw with Latin America, we still see some violence inherent in Africa today. I think the best example of that would be the Rwandan genocide. Rwanda is this country here, where we have the Hutus, who make up about 85% of the population, and the Tutsi, who were handpicked by the Belgians to rule after the Belgians left. We see violence between them. The Hutus try to kill the Tutsis. Some Tutsis do kill Hutus in retribution, by the way. It's not a one-sided conflict. And over 800,000 people are killed in 100 days during the Rwandan genocide in 1994. So this is one example of conflicts that have arisen in Africa because of political instability and economic dependency. And because these countries are not strong, centralized units, because they are so dependent on others still, sometimes we see violence happening, as we do in Latin America, as we do in Asian countries also. But generally speaking, we see Africa free by the 1960s, one of the last regions of the world that remains colonized, but not anymore. Today, what we do start to notice in Africa are the rise of really strong powers. For example, one of the biggest satellite dishes in the world is being built in South Africa as we speak. It's called Meerkat. Right? It's being built down there. It's massive. The biggest one in the world is actually in China, in southern provinces, but they're trying to build a rival one in here. Rwanda has become a technological capital, and Nigeria is one of the economic capitals of Africa. So we do see some hope and promise. But Africa's been on a very long journey, from centralized government to colonize, to free again.